Hi, I'm Matt from How To Decks, and today we're going to have a quick look at deck footings, how big to make them, how deep to dig them. Just to start with, as a general disclaimer, you must talk to your building certifier, structural engineer, licensed building professional before you undertake a deck building project for yourself, particularly if you're building something over 1 metre off the ground, because there is a risk called fall from heights if something goes wrong, and you can be liable depending on what's been done, and a few factors will come into it, but there is a real chance of you being liable for someone getting hurt. With that being said, let's take a look at some general rules to keep in mind and some general depths and stuff that you can use to build your own deck. So the first thing we want to have a look at is the types of soils that there are when you dig down. There's two types that we generally refer to, and that's like the topsoil and the natural ground or firm ground. So say for example this is your ground level, and then at some point when you dig down you'll notice the ground will change consistency. It'll go from like the topsoil stuff, and then it'll go into a bit more firmer stuff, and then from time to time you might even encounter just down a bit lower, you might find rock and something even harder again. And if you do encounter rock down low, it's generally referred to as like bedrock, but in most houses you won't find this unless you live in like Sydney or somewhere like that. So when you're digging down your footing, so you're digging down your footing to that, there's your ground level, that's your footing there. There's a minimum height you want to go to, and I would always say 600. You can get away with a little bit less if you've had the chance to speak to your structural engineer. So that's 600 down to the bottom of the hole. Now there's a thing like we were talking about. You need to socket into the firm ground or natural ground, and and a good rule of thumb is a minimum of 50 mil. So that's where you go from topsoil down to natural ground or firm ground. Keep that 50 mil. Now there's a bit of a caveat with this. It's not 600 or 50 mil. It's minimum 600 and a minimum of 50 mil. So for example, say your natural ground wasn't down here at 50 mil, but it was up here, and say that up there, where say from there down to the bottom of the footing was 300 mil, you still have to dig down the 600 mil. Now this is where it gets a little bit more interesting. So say for example you dig down your footing, you still haven't reached this firm ground line, and it comes down to about there. Well, you have to extend your footing down that much further to reach it. So you're now taking your footing from being 600 mil, you're now going, say that 50 mil plus whatever that distance is there, just for this, for example, say that's another 100 mil there. This footing in total is 750 mil deep. And there's a really important reason why you have to maintain natural ground or firm ground when doing your footings. So the reason why you need to stay into like material or like natural ground or firm ground for your deck is, say for example you've got 4 footings on the front of your deck, and then when you look at the ground, like say you dig down, there's your ground, and you dig down your 600 mil on all 4, and as you're digging down, the first 2, you find that the topsoil is right up, is only a small layer, and then you come down a bit further and it's a bit lower, and then the last few you don't actually reach the firm ground, and you've already done 600 mil. So the reason that you need to keep everything in firm ground is ground moves throughout the seasons. It'll go up and down, it'll shrink, it will contract, it will expand, it'll do all sorts of crazy things, particularly if you live in what we call highly reactive soil. That could be anything from clays. Further out you go, there's a black soil in a place up Queensland called Blackwater, where you've got to dig down so far and you've got to sleeve your footings to allow that top 1.5 meters of soil to move, and then the footing is bedded down lower below that. And the reason for this is if you have your deck two footings on firm ground, and then 2 footings are just floating in the topsoil, the 2 footings in the topsoil will move up and down a lot more and move around more than the other 2. So in the case of these ones, you actually have to extend your footing down that much further to get that 50mm socket into the natural ground. So say for example this one's only an extra 50mm deeper, so this footing is 650mm down. And then this one here, you don't find this until 200mm below the 600, so you're now at 800, then you've still got to go another 50mm. So this footing here on the end is 850mm deep. And this is super important. It's like, this is probably the most critical part of your whole deck, and that's because over time you don't want that movement to happen, and there is no coming back. Once you've dug your footings and you filled them with concrete, the only way to solve the problem later is to remove those footings and redo them. So the last thing we want to have a look at is how wide to make the hole. So for example, say your post that's going in is 100mm by 100mm. It's a square post. What you want to do is when you dig your footing, you always want to be a minimum of 100mm all the way around the post. So you want to be 100mm away, so this distance here, that distance there, same as there, and same across there. They're all 100mm away from the outside of the post. If you're using a smaller post, for example, say you're using a steel post and it was only 50mm by 50mm, you still want to maintain that minimum of 100mm. And the reason for that is concrete has very poor tensile strength and very high compression strength. So what that means is if you've only got a narrow slot here, say for example that there was only 50mm across, the concrete would crack through there and through there with movement over time. And then that means the footing now is only able to work effectively on 3 sides. This far side's not doing so much. And that's more in terms of bracing and stuff like that. If you're in a high wind area or your deck is being used by a lot of people, that will cause all of this to fail at some point in time. And then the last thing too with making your footing, I always, as a rule of thumb, only ever do them 300 by 300 as a minimum, and the reason for that is it's so much easier to dig, because it's very hard to get a shovel in the hole when it's smaller. And then the final point is when you're digging your footings, say for example you're down like that, you need to make sure your footing is nice and square. You don't round it out at the bottom, because the footing itself, they bear down on the whole surface of concrete. And if you've only got a point here, what you're effectively doing is making a point and forcing all the weight to come down like that. And it's not, instead of being spread over this whole surface area. So when you have a wider footing, it's much easier to dig. And then if you are going to use a machine like an auger or a bobcat to dig the hole, if the hole's a 300 by 300 hole, the auger on the machine has to cover that square area. So a 300 by 300 hole suddenly becomes a 400 to 450mm diameter pier, so that 300 by 300 square fits inside of it. So if your engineer has called for a 300 by 300 footing, you need to go that much bigger in your board pier so you get that bearing capacity, this part here, in the right size. So I hope that helps. If you've got any questions, leave a comment below, or you can have a look on our website at howtodecks.com.au.